It occurred to me the 250th anniversary of the Declaration in July. We're not talking enough about our country and why it's a great country. And it also occurred to me that tonight's program, there are two people I want to hear from, and I think you do too, Newt Gingrich and Victor Davis Hanson. Why do they think America is great? And I really believe there needs to be more discussion about this, because we hear from the Marxists and the Islamists and the Democrats and the woke right tearing us down, tearing us down. We are a great country. We are a great people with a great history. There's a reason we should be patriotic and excited about this anniversary. And Newt Gingrich, one of my favorites of all time, former Speaker of the House, former history teacher. Newt Gingrich, why is America great?
Well, I think America is great primarily because in our Declaration of Independence, we explain that our rights come from our Creator, that we are endowed by our Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Founding Fathers clearly believed that they were a revolutionary people, that what they were doing was a fundamental break with the history of the human race. Jefferson, for example, writes repeatedly about the empire of liberty. And by that, he doesn't mean going out and conquering. He means that the sheer power of having a constitution built around God, a constitution where you are empowered, would attract so many people and be so desirable worldwide that it would ultimately undermine the czars, the kings, the emperors, the dictators. And I think virtually all the Founding Fathers had this sense that they weren't just local politicians engaged in some fight over taxation. They were, in fact, defining a new world order in a way which liberated all of us. So every American has the right, not from the government, not from the bureaucrat, not from the lawyer, has the right from God to pursue happiness, which is an active term. Doesn't give you a right to be happy, doesn't suggest we ought to have happiness stamps or a federal department of happiness, but it says you have a right to go out, work your heart out, do what you believe in, chase the things you want to chase, and in that process, have an opportunity to become happy. And happy, by the way, in the late 18th century was a term from the Scottish Enlightenment, which actually meant wisdom and virtue. That they weren't talking about hedonism or getting drunk 5 nights a week. They were talking about your obligation to lead a good life, and in that process, to know that you're doing so as a child of God. And I think that profoundly liberated the people who came here, whether they were born here or they migrated here, up until the rise of the anti-American left, which has worked systematically for the last 70 years to undermine the country and to repudiate it. But even so, after all that effort by the left, overwhelmingly, we Americans believe that we are a remarkably free people and that our country is truly an exceptional nation.
That's very well put. So here we have these men, different backgrounds. All of them were very well read. They read the ancients, they read philosophers, they talked about reading the Hebrew Bible. What was it that influenced them most, do you think? I mean, they could have met in Philadelphia the first time on the Declaration. They could have met in Philadelphia the second time on the Constitution, the seized power. We see most of these revolutions all over the world. They become dictatorships or communist politburos or that sort of thing. And yet they debated and they fought with each other, not over how to keep power and centralize power, but how to create a society, a nation where power was checking power and so forth. Isn't this unique in human history?
Well, I think there are two parts of this. One goes back to the Roman mythology of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a local farmer who had a crisis put down his plow, took up a sword, saved the Roman Republic, and then went back to being a farmer. And in a sense, if you go to Annapolis, where in the state capitol, there is a room that has the statues of the members of the Continental Congress and have George Washington standing. And it's a fascinating moment. Washington has come to put down his sword. They are seated because they have precedent over him, even though he's the general of the armies. But they are the elected representatives of the people. And this group all believed in some mythical way, or maybe mystical way, in the idea of the people. When King George III heard that Washington had voluntarily gone home, back to Mount Vernon, he said, if that's true, he is the greatest man of the century, for the reason you mentioned. He didn't seize power. In fact, the one time that his officers came to him very late in the process, they hadn't been paid. They were furious at the Congress. The Congress was, frankly, as much in disrepute back then as it is now, and they wanted to mutiny. And Washington shows up in a schoolroom where they're meeting, and he pulls out his glasses for the purpose of reminding them that he had grown old in pursuing the revolution. And he read a brief note that said, if we were to mutiny against the Congress, we would have violated everything which we stood for and fought for. And they all listened to him and said, okay, I guess that's right, and went home. So that you had this core group who saw themselves as principled. They weren't rebelling over something minor. They weren't rebelling in the end over trivial things. They had reached a conclusion, really drawn out of the English experience going back to Runnymede and the signing of the Magna Carta, a copy of which exists in the US Capitol. And the Magna Carta was a first tentative step where the barons basically said, we will give you a grant of you, the king, a grant of money, if you agree that our vote is decisive and that we have the right to not give you the money. Well, King John, who was a very weak king and not particularly popular, concluded that he had no choice. He hated it, violated it as soon as he could. But he signs this document, which in effect limits his kingship. Now, there was a great belief in the Middle Ages that there was a divine right, that you got to be king because God made you king. And therefore, to rebel against you was to rebel against God. And the bishop and the barons said, no, you're a political figure. We accept that you're the king, but then you have to accept that we have rights too. And the original Magna Carta only applies to the barons. Doesn't apply to the serfs or the peasants or the middle class, but it begins a tradition starting in 1215 that year by year grows. And by the time that the founding fathers are doing all their reading, there had begun to be a very deep tradition, deeply influenced by the English Civil War, and leading to a sense of that there are rights which transcend the kingship, that the king, in fact, is not supreme, is not divine. The king is a very powerful, important figure who ought to be respected, but then the king should be earning that respect. And it's a fascinating moment in time.
Where did this idea come from, power checking power? Because when you read the Constitution, that's what it's all about, you know. The three branches of government, Congress is bicameral, only the House is directly elected, the senators were chosen by the state legislatures, we have an electoral college, we have limits on with judges in terms of lifetime appointments so they're not affected by the mob or the popular will. Where did all those ideas come from?
Well, I think it's important to remember, first of all, these are almost all propertied people. So they have an interest in stability because they don't want their house burned down. They don't want their business confiscated. They are frightened by Shays' Rebellion, which was an anti-inflation populist rebellion in Western Massachusetts. And they call upon Washington to have a meeting, and they meet first in Annapolis, and then they call a meeting in Philadelphia. And so what they're doing is they are actively trying to think through two core questions. The first is you have to have a government strong enough that the British, the French, the Spanish can't take over the colonies. And their fear was that they would lose one by one, that Maine would be gone, or Massachusetts would be gone, or Georgia would be gone. And so you have to have a government which brings together all of the Eastern seaboard in order to protect yourself from these foreign governments. Second, if you're going to have a government that's strong enough to stop the British or the French or the Spanish, then what are you going to do to stop that government from taking away your rights? And they'd read history. They understood all this. They understood. One of the things they feared was the Greek situation where the mob gradually destroyed democracy and destroyed freedom. So they were very much attracted to the Roman Republic before it became corrupted and destroyed, and the balance that the Romans tried to find in the law, which happened after the last Roman king was eliminated in 476 BC. And for about 400 years, Rome had a relatively balanced system in which power was divided. That was all captured by a French theoretician named Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws, a book he wrote called The Spirit of the Laws. And Montesquieu says, the most stable system is a system in which you divide power three ways. You have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, and you balance them against each other. And so in many ways, they're captured by Montesquieu's model. And they sit there in Philadelphia, they argue it out, they design this government, and it's based around a line that comes, I believe, from Madison, that, if people were angels, you wouldn't have to worry about government. But because people aren't angels, you have to worry about the people you're giving power to, because by definition, they're not angels. So how do we then control them? And their answer was, you divide power so that power protects you from the people to whom you loan power. And that's the heart of the American system.
Separation of powers is the heart of the American system. You've said that, I've said that, the great late Antonin Scalia said that's the key. Otherwise, the Constitution is nothing but a piece of parchment. That's the key, honoring separation of powers and so forth.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube, and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.